Various military forces around the world have used their own trains and networks to transport a variety of items from munitions to personnel. Join me in this video as I show you how I made the most of this Budget Model Railways 3D printed 00 gauge locomotive and rolling stock kit using some simple and cost-effective techniques to create my own custom military train. Hi, I'm Matt and this is Model Minutes. Before I start the build of this model, please remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. For a more in-depth look at the parts of these kits, you can find a detailed unboxing video on this subject I previously made on my channel. For this video though, I will primarily be focusing on how they build up and completing the video with a final review. I would also like to thank Budget Model Railways for sending these kits to me free of charge for the purposes of building and reviewing, but all opinions and comments do remain my own. These kits will present a number of challenges as it is slightly different to the models I normally build, as these are all 3D printed and not injection moulded. So let's start the build of this military train by building the wagon kit. The parts come in a dense grey plastic which will require a little bit of cleaning up. I carefully removed the excess plastic left over from the printing process by sanding it away or cutting it off using a sharp knife. I was told that polycement can be used to glue the plastic parts together, so decided to start by using Revell contactor. The sides of the wagon glue into grooves in the base, but I found that the cement took quite a while to bond. So to try and make things a little quicker, I cracked open the superglue and decided to use that as well. It is my thought that using both superglue and polycement will help strengthen the bond of the plastic. The superglue provides that initial hold and then allows the polycement that extra time to work into the plastic and meld the two surfaces together. Using this process, the body of the wagon can be built up quite quickly, as it is quite simply a box with 4 sides and a base. Finally, an additional floor is provided which I glued inside the wagon. It will help add strength to the model and provide a base for any load I choose to add. With the build done, I needed to add a chassis. I had this old Triang wagon chassis in the spares box and it turned out that it would be a perfect fit. I cleaned this up a bit by removing the old glue and plastic from the top to make sure it would have a nice level surface for the wagon body to attach to. Budget Model Railways have designed their kits with 4 holes in the base of the wagon body so that it will slot over the 4 pegs in the corner of the wagon, which I found lined up perfectly. I'm not going to attach the chassis permanently at this stage, I'll do some painting first. The first step was to use this cheap grey primer as the base layer, and working in a side-to-side motion I coated the entire wagon body in an even layer. Please remember when spray painting to use a well ventilated environment and wear the appropriate protective equipment. The next step was to thin Humbrol 106 Ocean Grey matte acrylic with Tamiya acrylic thinners X20A at a rough ratio of 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. I then applied this to the entire wagon body using a medium flat brush for quick coverage. Thinning the paint will mean that there are fewer visible brush strokes, but might mean I need a few layers before I get a uniform finish. Next, I thought I might add a load to the wagon, so I raided my spares box and found lots of aircraft parts that could be added to the inside. My thoughts are that this will become a Royal Air Force military train, and this kind of thing would be interesting to see. I used superglue and polycement to hold all these various parts in place inside the wagon, and I arranged them in such a way that it would be visibly interesting. With that done, I masked the edges of the wagon and then sprayed the internal areas with this cheap matte black spray paint. Having done this, I could remove the masking tape and move on to the next step. Humbrol 30 dark green acrylic was thinned with Tamiya acrylic thinners, just like the previous painting step, but this time I applied the paint into a camouflage pattern similar to that of RAF aircraft during the Second World War. I used a thinner brush to do this as it would give more control. Whilst the paint was drying, I decided to work on the chassis. It was absolutely filthy from all its years in the spares box, so I gave it a wash in warm soapy water to remove all the dirt. Doing this would mean that there is a clean surface for paint to stick to. I put the chassis to one side to let it dry, and I used this time to do a little detailing. Humbrol 33 matte black was used to pick out the details of the ladders on the ends of the wagons. I did this using the paint straight out of the pot and with a fine brush. Next, I sealed all the paint with this plastic coat satin varnish. This will form a uniform base layer for the decals I want to apply and help prevent them from leaving any silvering on the decal film. I dove into the spares box once more and found these decals from a previously completed kit. I thought they would make good serial numbers for the wagon. I cut the ones I wanted to use and soaked the sheet in warm water to release the decals from the backing paper. Humbrol Decal Fix was applied to the model in the correct areas, and this solution will help soften the decals into the surface of the plastic and make them look painted on. I carefully slid the decals off the backing paper and then placed them on the model, making sure I got them in the correct position and they were left to cure just a little bit. So a further coat of decal fits can then be brushed over the top to help soften them even more. Now that the decals are curing, I moved back to the chassis, which is now dry from its wash. A quick coat of the black matte spray paint will give a nice uniform finish and help cover up the damaged and rusty areas. Having left the decals to cure for some time, they can now be protected with this matte spray varnish. Thin, even layers were applied until I got the finish I was looking for. Humbrol 11 Silver can then be dry brushed over the wagon load to give the impression that the aircraft parts are on their way to be scrapped. To dry brush, paint is loaded onto the brush, then removed onto a paper towel until it feels dry. It is then brushed over the details and the residue collects on the raised areas, highlighting them and adding contrast. Humbrol 12 Copper Metallic was mixed with 53 Gunmetal Grey to create a more rusty kind of colour. Then this was also dry brushed over the scrap load in the wagon to add further detail. I also applied this in various places on the body of the wagon to give the impression that it wasn't particularly well looked after. Citadel Nuln Oil was now used to bring out the details. I brushed it over the wagon body, and as it is quite a thin wash, it would collect in the recessed areas, helping to add contrast and shadow. When it had dried, I carefully removed any excess wash using cotton buds dipped in Tamiya acrylic thinners, which would help to increase the contrast further. It's worth noting that had I not protected the paint with the matte spray varnish earlier, the previous acrylic layers would also be removed at this step. Now it's time to join the chassis and the body together. I made sure the wagon weight was in place in the centre of the chassis, then used some super glue to make sure the body would stay in place. I feel as though there is still something missing, so I removed the wheels from the chassis once again before adding a little more weathering. Humbrol 93 Desert Yellow Matte Acrylic was dry brushed over the chassis and the lower areas of the wagon body, which I hoped would give the impression of accumulated dirt and grime from it being used over the military network. I made sure to not forget the wheels and highlighted the spokes in the same colour. With that done and the paint dry, the wheels were reattached to their slots in the chassis, and this wagon is now complete. Having decided on this as the paint scheme I want to use on the rest of my military train, I will use these methods to create a fairly uniform look for this project. To that end, as I progress through the rest of the video, I will mention the steps but not go into as much detail as I have already explained them here. So let's move on to completing the passenger coach. For this one, I have identified another wagon chassis from the spares box, this time with metal wheels though, as I have the intention of adding lights to the inside of the coach for a little bit more operational interest. The chassis is a slightly different size and doesn't quite fit as perfectly as the chassis I used for the wagon, but it'll do the job. Again, the first step was to clean up and remove the excess plastic left over from the printing process. I made some small holes using a small drill bit, and it was my intention that the electrical pickups for the wheels be passed through these. I settled on using this fine steel wire as the method of transmitting the track power, which I bent through the holes so they were just touching the wheels. At the time, this was the best thing I had that would do this job, but in hindsight some thinner wire would have been better, as this did apply quite a lot of resistance and prevent the wheels from turning in places. I added small drops of superglue to make sure they stayed in place. I then passed the wires through the holes in the base of the coach body. These would have located onto the other chassis type, as used in the previous wagon build, but as this chassis doesn't have those moulded lugs, I thought this would be the best use for those holes. I used the side of the coach to measure the height of the roof, and then cut the wires to length. I added solder to the ends of the wires in preparation for the next step. More lengths of wires were soldered onto the long edges of the coach to join them together, and I'm effectively making a frame that won't be visible through the windows but will bring power to the internal lights. I'm going to use two of these white 12-volt lighthouse LEDs wired up in parallel but in opposite directions, so that one will illuminate the inside of the coach when power is applied to the track, irregardless of the direction the locomotive is moving. I used some superglue to hold them together. They were then soldered across the centre of the frames I'd previously made and the excess wires cut away. I can now start test fitting the sides of the coach. Having made a few test fits, I found that the plastic was a little thick, so had to cut some grooves in the plastic on the ends to accommodate these wire frames. I protected the LEDs with some masking tape, whilst also covering the chassis to protect it in the next step. The parts were then sprayed with the same matte black paint from before, and you'll note that I found some pilot figures from the spares box which are going to become the passengers. They were also given a coat of the same paint. The outsides of the coach body were given a coat of the grey primer, much like the wagon I built previously. As a nod to the internal areas of RAF aircraft, I decided to paint the seating areas of the coach in Humbrol 78 cockpit green, which I had thinned with Tamiya thinners. Humbrol 29 Dark Earth was used on the tabletops and seats. I had to cut the legs of the pilot figures off to get them to fit inside the coach. These pilots were painted with Humbrol 96 RAF Blue matte enamel, which I did straight out of the pot. As enamel has a longer drying time, it will be a little while before I can work on them again, so I used this time to glue some windows inside the coach. I cut some clear plastic into the right size, and this plastic comes from packaging which would otherwise have been recycled. I used superglue to hold it together. Now back to the pilots. Humbrol 29 Dark Earth was used to pick out their flying helmets, and Humbrol 61 Flesh on their faces. They were then glued into various seats inside the coach. I then started to add all the sides of the coach, again using the superglue and polycement combination from before. With that done, I repeated the same painting process as I did for the wagon, using Humbrol 106 Ocean Grey as the base colour, then adding the camouflage using Humbrol 30 Dark Green. The roof was given a coat of 32 Dark Grey. I applied some decals in the exact same way as the wagon previously. I decided to use some RAF roundels from the spares box on this one to make it a little more interesting. With the decals applied and sealed as before, Citadel Nuln Oil was once again used to bring out some of the recessed details. Finally, I repeated the dry brushing of the Humbrol 93 Desert Yellow to give the impression of accumulated dirt and grime from being used. And that's the RAF pilot's carriage now complete with its working lights. 2 down, 1 to go. The final part of this build is the military shunting locomotive. As before, many techniques and steps such as the painting, decals and weathering are repeated, so I will gloss over those and focus on the slightly different steps. The first thing I did was to drill out the lights on the bonnets of the Loco. I used a 2mm drill bit as it seemed to be a perfect fit. It is my intention to add working directional lights to this, and I have some 2mm LEDs which would look great. Again, the various parts were all cleaned up before gluing them together. I repeated the polycement and superglue combination from before and started building up the general shape of the locomotive. There are little slots and tabs that help get all the parts in the right places. The buffers have to have their excess material cut away and cleaned up before they can be glued into their holes in the buffer beams. With the general frame of the locomotive complete, the internal areas were given a coat of Humbrol 32 dark grey. I managed to get a Hornby 040 chassis for about £8 from their website just before Christmas in 2019, and it is ideal as this kit is designed to fit this exact style of chassis. As mentioned, I'm using these 2mm lighthouse LEDs, and I'll be using white for the forwards direction and red will light up at the rear. The LEDs were glued into place with 2 white ones being at each end in the outer light holes, whilst the red ones would take up the centre ones. They will have to be wired in parallel so they light up correctly, but to make them directional, the correct ones will have to be wired up in the opposite direction. After some fiddly soldering, I managed to correctly solder them together with wires attached, which will go to the motor. I'll pop a wiring diagram on the screen, which hopefully might make it a little more obvious how I did this. It looks quite simple there, but the real test was getting all the wires in the right place, particularly with the small amount of space available inside the model. With that done, I added the chassis, which simply clips into place, and then soldered the power wires to the correct locations on the motor so that the LEDs would now work in parallel with the motor. It doesn't look particularly tidy now that I've done that, but it's all going to be hidden when I add the roof parts to the Loco. The roofs were glued carefully into place on the bonnets of the model, but before I can add the ones on the cab, I need to add the window glazing. This was done in the same way as the coach by cutting some scrap plastic packaging into strips and gluing it into place. The buffer beams can now be added, and then this was followed by the cab roof. Some steps can be glued into their slots on the base of the locomotive body. There were some gaps left over from the assembly process, particularly where I'd been less than careful with my soldering iron and accidentally melted a few areas. I fixed these by applying some Humbrol model filler into these places and then would sand it smooth when it had dried. I used Humbrol 32 dark grey acrylic as the first layer of paint on this model, taking care to not get it on the chassis or the clear windows. 33 matte black was then used on the roofs. Instead of opting for the camouflage pattern of the previous two kits, I decided to paint the whole body of the locomotive in Humbrol 30 dark green. Humbrol 60 matte scarlet was used on the buffer beams, taking care to get it in the right places. I applied Humbrol 135 satin varnish to the areas that were going to take some decals, and then these were applied in the exact same way as the previous kits. I mixed Humbrol 49 matte varnish and 135 satin varnish to give a semi-matte finish, and then after thinning this paint I painted it over the entire model to protect the decals. Again, I applied the same weathering as before, using the desert yellow paint to represent dirt and grime. And that's it. That's as far as I went with my build of the budget model railways, wagon, coach and shunting locomotive kits in my own custom military train livery. At the time I built these models, I hadn't yet built my garden railway, so unfortunately had nowhere to test them out. But after sending them back to Budget Model Railways for their use, they sent me some videos of it running on their layout. And I have to admit, it looks even better there. So, let's do a bit of a review on these kits. The shunting locomotive body kit was available on their website for £15 at the time this video was made, whilst the wagon and coach body kits were listed as £5 each. I think for having a product like this at these prices is quite a good deal, as many ready-to-run models are considerably more expensive. You will have to provide your own chassis for these kits though, so depending on how you obtain yours, you might be able to keep costs quite low. Looking at the rough cost of this build, the spray paints I used were £1 a tin, the chassis cost £8, the LEDs were only a couple of pounds, so let's say £2 there, but I do still have more LEDs that I can use for other projects, and everything else I already had from other kits or previously built projects. So if we add the prices of the kits, the whole military train would only really cost about £40 to create, which in my opinion is not too bad, especially as I've built something unique with working lights and probably would be hard pressed to find even just a locomotive ready to run for that price. But what about the quality of the kit? As I mentioned in the previous videos on these kits, they are 3D printed and this presents its own challenges. The plastic is harder and a little more difficult to work with. You may find some gaps between the parts as you build the kit too, which might benefit from some filler. The detail though is quite good and the kits are simple to build. So let's wrap this one up. These are some neat little kits of interesting subjects that allow you to display your creativity for a budget price. Once again, I'd like to extend my thanks to Budget Model Railways for sending me these samples to review and build, and I hope you guys enjoy watching it run around your layout. For more information on where you can get your BMR kit, take a look at the link in the description. But before I go, I've got a couple of questions for you. What do you think of this kind of kit? Do you think it's value for money, and do you think you would get one for yourself? As always, let me know what you thought of my finished build in the comments below, and feel free to post suggestions for other videos you might like to see too. Honourable mention to my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks to the generous support of these guys, it allows me to continue to produce content for you all to watch, through purchasing of consumables such as paints and brushes, to new kits and products to review. To find out more about what pledging gets you, including early access to videos, amongst other things, take a look at the link in the description. Don't forget that you can connect with me on social media too. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and my own Discord server. Oh, and if you made it this far, please consider pressing that thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video, and if you subscribe with notifications on, you won't miss any future builds or reviews I upload. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.